They dismantled the old palace in sections. Brick by brick, room by room, an entire aristocratic world reduced to salvage and architectural memory. When Buckingham House finally disappeared in the 1820s, replaced by something larger and more coldly institutional, no one mourned publicly. The building had become a problem, too private for a monarchy that needed visibility, too expensive for a crown that pretended otherwise, too tied to an idea of power that was already becoming obsolete. What stood in its place would carry the same name but serve a different function entirely. The original Buckingham House was never meant to be a palace. It was built as a retreat, a statement of taste over spectacle, a nobleman's fantasy of enlightened privacy in an age when such things still seemed possible. For nearly a century it remained exactly that, a mansion occupied by people who believed wealth entitled them to withdraw from the public gaze. But institutions do not tolerate withdrawal. The crown needed a London seat, and Buckingham House, by accident, by inheritance, by purchase, became the price of that need. Its transformation was not an elevation. It was an extraction. The decision was made without ceremony. In 1825, George IV authorized the reconstruction of Buckingham House into something the monarchy could occupy publicly. The language used in parliamentary debates was bureaucratic, inadequate accommodation, insufficient staterooms, structural limitations. No one spoke openly about what the decision actually meant, that the house, as it had existed for more than a century, would cease to exist. John Nash, the king's architect, was given the commission. His task was not restoration. It was replacement. The original structure, red brick, compact, proportioned for domestic rather than ceremonial life, was deemed architecturally obsolete. Its interiors, designed for private cultivation and selective entertaining, could not accommodate the functions a working palace required. The building was too small for state banquets, too inward-facing for public ritual, too tied to an older model of aristocratic withdrawal that no longer served the crown's political needs. What followed was not preservation. It was extraction. The house was gutted methodically. Walls were torn down to create larger reception spaces. Entire wings were demolished to make room for extensions. The original façade, built in warm bath stone, was covered over with a new exterior designed to project imperial scale rather than cultivated taste. Rooms that had once displayed one of England's finest private art collections were subdivided, expanded, or erased entirely to create the infrastructure of monarchy: throne rooms, audience chambers, administrative corridors. The process was expensive and controversial. Costs escalated rapidly, reaching figures that horrified Parliament and embarrassed the Crown. By 1828, Nash's budget had spiraled far beyond initial estimates, prompting inquiries and public criticism. The king defended the expenditure as necessary modernization. His critics saw it as aristocratic excess disguised as duty. Both were correct. The reconstruction was necessary, but not because the house had failed. It was necessary because the institution it now served required something the house had never been designed to provide. The work continued for years. Laborers dismantled sections of the original building while construction proceeded around them. The site became a permanent construction zone, chaotic and costly, its completion perpetually delayed. George IV would never live in the finished palace. He died in 1830, before Nash's vision was complete. His successor, William IV, showed little interest in the project and preferred to remain at other royal residences. The palace, built at extraordinary expense to serve the monarchy's ceremonial needs, stood largely empty during its first decade of existence. By the time Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, Buckingham Palace was still unfinished. She would be the first monarch to occupy it as a primary residence, and her tenure would finally establish its function as the monarchy's public face. But the building she inherited bore almost no resemblance to the house George III had purchased in 1761. The architecture had been replaced. The interiors had been reconfigured. The purpose had been inverted. What had been lost was not merely architectural. The demolition erased a specific model of elite life, one in which power derived partly from the ability to withdraw, to curate privacy, to demonstrate cultivation without public performance. Buckingham House had embodied that model completely. It was built to be admired from a distance, entered selectively, experienced intimately. Its interiors were designed for connoisseurship, not crowds. Its gardens were meant for contemplation, not ceremony. The palace that replaced it inverted every principle. Where the house had been inward-facing, the palace projected outward. Where the house had privileged private taste, the palace prioritized public legibility. Where the house had been a retreat from state obligation, the palace became the physical center of state performance. The transformation succeeded functionally. Buckingham Palace would serve the monarchy's needs for nearly 2 centuries, but it succeeded by erasing the very qualities that had once made the site valuable. Nash's design was not universally admired. Contemporary critics found it architecturally confused, stylistically inconsistent, too grandiose in ambition and too compromised in execution. The exterior lacked coherence. The proportions felt strained. The additions did not integrate seamlessly with what remained of the original structure. The palace worked as infrastructure, but it failed as architecture. It was functional without being distinguished, large without being beautiful, necessary without being desired. The original Buckingham House had been none of these things. It had been coherent, proportioned, intentional. Its architecture expressed a worldview, rational, cultivated, confident in its own restraint. The palace expressed nothing except scale and obligation. It was a building designed by committee, built under political pressure, shaped by compromise rather than vision. It served its purpose, but it possessed no identity of its own. By the 1840s, the transformation was complete. The house was gone. The palace stood in its place, operational and occupied, fulfilling the functions for which it had been built. Queen Victoria conducted state business there. Foreign dignitaries were received in its new reception rooms. The monarchy had gained visibility, infrastructure, and a London seat adequate to its ceremonial requirements. But something had been subtracted. The idea that power could be exercised quietly, through culture rather than display, through withdrawal rather than performance, that idea had no place in the new building. The palace did not allow for it. Its architecture demanded visibility. Its scale required constant use. Its public function consumed any possibility of private refinement. The demolition of Buckingham House in the 1820s was presented as modernization. It was recorded as necessary adaptation. But it marked a deeper shift, one that went beyond architecture. It was the moment when the British monarchy fully abandoned the model of aristocratic domesticity and committed itself entirely to institutional performance. The house had represented one kind of power. The palace represented another. The transition was irreversible. Nothing of the original building remains visible today. Every trace was covered, removed, or absorbed into later construction. The palace that tourists photograph, that serves as the backdrop for state occasions, that symbolizes the British monarchy in the global imagination, it stands on the site of Buckingham House, but it bears no memory of what once existed there. The erasure was complete. In Georgian England, there existed a particular hierarchy of prestige that operated independently of political office. To hold power at court was one thing. To be recognized as a person of taste was another. The two did not always align, and among the highest ranks of the aristocracy, taste often mattered more than proximity to the throne. Buckingham House occupied a specific position within this hierarchy. It was not the largest estate in England. It was not the oldest. But for nearly half a century after its completion, it was understood as something more valuable than either, a house that proved its owner's cultural authority. The distinction mattered because Georgian aristocratic culture was built on codes of refinement that required constant demonstration. Wealth alone did not confer status. Lineage helped but was insufficient. What separated the truly elevated from the merely rich was the ability to live in a manner that suggested effortless cultivation, to collect the right art, employ the right architects, entertain with the right balance of generosity and exclusivity. Buckingham House was designed to succeed on all of these measures simultaneously. Its architecture was restrained but unmistakably expensive. The design avoided ostentation while signaling serious investment. The proportions followed classical principles without slavish imitation. The materials, Bath stone, fine woodwork, imported marble, were chosen not for drama but for their quiet assertion of quality. The house communicated clearly, its owner understood what mattered and possessed the resources to achieve it without vulgarity. This was not accidental. The Duke of Buckingham built the house to establish himself as a figure of cultural weight, not merely political influence. He had held office, served the crown, accumulated titles and honors. But his ambitions extended beyond government. He sought recognition as a patron, a connoisseur, a man whose judgment in matters of art and architecture carried authority. The house was his most public argument for that status. It succeeded partly because it avoided competition with royal architecture. Buckingham House was never intended to rival the scale of Windsor or the ceremonial gravity of St. James's Palace. It operated in a different register entirely. Where royal buildings were designed for state function and public display, Buckingham House was designed for selective inhabitation and private admiration. It was not a palace. It was a showcase of discernment, a building that invited comparison not with other seats of power but with the great country estates and continental villas that represented the apex of aristocratic taste. The location reinforced this positioning. Built on the western edge of London, the house occupied land that was neither fully urban nor fully rural. It stood close enough to the centers of political life to remain relevant, but far enough to suggest a degree of autonomy. The surrounding gardens were extensive, designed in the formal style but with careful attention to sightlines and spatial experience. The house did not dominate its landscape. It settled into it, as though it had always belonged there. This sense of belonging, of architecture that felt inevitable rather than imposed, was central to the house's cultural meaning. Georgian taste valued naturalness, or at least the appearance of it. The ideal was a life lived with such refinement that effort became invisible. Buckingham House embodied this ideal completely. Its interiors were luxurious but not theatrical. Its art collection was exceptional but displayed without showmanship. The house functioned as a stage for aristocratic life, but the performance it enabled was one of studied ease. The cultural work the house performed extended beyond its owner. It served as a reference point, a standard against which other aristocratic projects were measured. When a nobleman commissioned a new estate or refurbished an old one, Buckingham House was part of the conversation, not as a model to copy, but as a benchmark of what seriousness looked like. Architects cited it. Visitors described it in letters. It appeared in accounts of London's notable buildings, always with the understanding that its significance lay not in size or spectacle but in the precision of its execution. This reputation depended on access remaining limited. The house was not open to the public. It was not a destination for casual tourists. Entry required invitation, connection, or status. The selectivity was deliberate. To be received at Buckingham House meant something. It confirmed one's position within a specific social and cultural elite. The house functioned as a gatekeeping mechanism, its doors open only to those who already understood the codes it represented. Inside, the experience reinforced this exclusivity. The interiors were arranged to guide visitors through a carefully calibrated sequence of spaces, each revealing a different aspect of the owner's cultivation. The entrance hall established tone. The gallery displayed the art collection, works chosen not for their fame but for their quality, arranged to demonstrate connoisseurship rather than wealth. The library suggested intellectual engagement. The staterooms balanced formality with comfort, creating environments where serious conversation could unfold without stiffness. Every detail was considered. The furniture was commissioned from the finest craftsmen. The textiles were imported. The decorative elements, plasterwork, paneling, fireplaces, were executed with a level of care that bordered on obsessive. But the overall effect was not one of excess. The house avoided the Baroque extravagance that characterized some aristocratic interiors. It aimed instead for a kind of refined restraint that required more discipline, and more expense, than outright opulence. This aesthetic philosophy reflected a broader cultural shift within the English aristocracy. By the early 18th century, the model of power based purely on land and lineage was giving way to something more complex. Education mattered. Travel mattered. Cultural literacy mattered. The aristocracy was redefining itself not merely as a landed class but as a cultivated one, and Buckingham House was an architectural argument for that redefinition. The house also represented a form of power that did not depend on royal favor. Its owner was not a courtier. He did not derive his status from proximity to the throne. He built the house with his own wealth, on his own land, according to his own vision. This independence was part of the point. Buckingham House demonstrated that aristocratic authority could exist parallel to royal authority, that cultural prestige could be self-generated rather than bestowed. For half a century, this model held. The house remained privately owned, privately inhabited, a monument to the idea that the highest form of power was the power to withdraw and cultivate one's own domain. But that model depended on a specific set of conditions: economic stability, social consensus, a shared understanding of what aristocratic life should look like. When those conditions began to shift, the house's cultural position shifted with them. By the time the Crown purchased Buckingham House in 1761, its meaning had already begun to change. It was no longer the statement of an individual aristocrat. It was becoming something else, a property whose location, scale, and architectural quality made it useful to the monarchy. The transition was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But it was irreversible. The house that had been built to demonstrate independence from royal power would become absorbed by it, and in the process, everything it had represented would be quietly erased. John Sheffield was 56 when he began construction of Buckingham House. He had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of English politics, serving under multiple monarchs, shifting allegiances when necessary, accumulating titles and offices through a combination of competence and strategic positioning. By 1703, he held the title Duke of Buckingham and Normanby, had served as Lord Privy Seal, and possessed wealth substantial enough to fund a major architectural project. But his motivations for building were not primarily political. They were personal, and in some ways, corrective. Sheffield had spent much of his career at court. He understood its rhythms, its hierarchies, its exhausting demands for constant performance. He had observed how proximity to royal power required a particular kind of self-presentation, theatrical, carefully managed, relentlessly public. He had participated in that system successfully, but he did not admire it. Court culture, by the turn of the 18th century, had become rowdy, factional, and vulgar in ways that offended Sheffield's sense of propriety. The house he envisioned would be an antidote to all of that. The site he chose was significant. The land sat west of London's developed core, in an area that was still largely open. It was close enough to Westminster and St. James's to remain connected to political life, but far enough to suggest separation. The location allowed Sheffield to maintain relevance without immersion, to stay proximate to power without being consumed by it. This was not exile. It was strategic withdrawal. He hired William Wynd as his architect, though Sheffield himself appears to have exercised considerable control over the design. The instructions were clear: the house should be substantial but not enormous, classical but not derivative, impressive but not ostentatious. It should communicate seriousness of purpose. It should feel both English and cosmopolitan, drawing on continental influences without slavish imitation. Above all, it should project an image of rational order, architecture as the physical expression of an enlightened mind. The resulting design reflected these ambitions precisely. The house was rectangular, symmetrical, 3 stories high with a central block flanked by shorter wings. The façade was built in red brick with stone dressings, a material choice that avoided the coldness of pure stone while maintaining dignity. The proportions were carefully calibrated, large enough to accommodate a significant household and entertain guests of status, but restrained enough to avoid the palatial scale that would have felt inappropriate for a private residence. The plan was organized around a clear hierarchy of spaces. The ground floor contained service areas and functional rooms. The first floor, the piano nobile, held the principal staterooms where Sheffield would receive visitors and conduct the social rituals expected of someone of his rank. The second floor provided private apartments. This vertical organization was conventional, but Sheffield's execution of it was meticulous. Every room was positioned to maximize light, circulation, and spatial flow. The house was designed to be experienced as a sequence, each space preparing the visitor for the next. Sheffield's vision extended beyond architecture. He planned the interiors with equal attention, commissioning craftsmen to execute paneling, plasterwork, and decorative elements that would establish the house's cultural credentials. He began assembling an art collection, paintings, sculpture, objets d'art, chosen not randomly but as part of a coherent program. The collection was meant to demonstrate that he possessed not merely wealth but discernment, that he understood the difference between acquisition and connoisseurship. The gardens received similar care. Sheffield laid out formal grounds that extended the house's architectural logic into the landscape. Geometric beds, carefully planned sightlines, ornamental features positioned to create visual interest without overwhelming the natural topography. The gardens were not wild, but neither were they rigidly controlled. They represented the same principle as the house itself, order applied thoughtfully, reason expressed through design. The construction process itself was slow and expensive, as all serious architectural projects were. Sheffield financed it entirely from his own resources, refusing to compromise on quality or rush completion. This was not a speculative venture. It was not a property developed for resale or dynastic expansion. It was a monument to a specific idea of how a cultivated man should live, and that idea required patience, investment, and uncompromising attention to detail. By 1705, the house was habitable, though work continued for years afterward on interiors and grounds. Sheffield moved in and began the process of inhabiting the space as he had intended. He entertained selectively, hosting gatherings that emphasized conversation and cultural exchange over political maneuvering. He displayed his art collection in a manner that invited serious viewing rather than casual admiration. He used the library, walked the gardens, occupied the house in ways that enacted the vision he had built it to support. The project was partly about legacy. Sheffield had no illusions about his place in history. He was not a figure of singular political importance. He had never commanded armies or reshaped policy in fundamental ways. But he understood that cultural contributions could outlast political ones, that a house built with sufficient care and thought could establish a reputation that transcended its builder's lifetime. Buckingham House was his attempt to secure that kind of permanence. It was also a statement about autonomy. Sheffield had risen through service to the crown, but he did not believe that royal favor was the ultimate measure of worth. The house declared a different kind of authority, one based on personal cultivation, intellectual engagement, and aesthetic judgment. It said that a man of means and education could create something of lasting value without needing validation from the throne. This was not rebellion. It was assertion. The ideology embedded in the house was distinctly rationalist. Sheffield believed in order, proportion, classical principles applied thoughtfully. He believed that architecture could express philosophical commitments, that the way one lived physically could reflect the way one thought. The house embodied Enlightenment ideals before the Enlightenment had fully crystallized as a cultural movement. It represented the conviction that human beings could shape their environments according to reason, that beauty and function were not opposed but interdependent. Sheffield died in 1721, less than 2 decades after completing the house. His widow continued to live there, maintaining it much as he had established it. The house passed eventually to their son, and then to their grandson, remaining within the family for decades. During this period, it fulfilled exactly the purpose Sheffield had envisioned. It was admired, visited by those whose opinion mattered, referenced in discussions of architectural merit. It served as a model of what private wealth, applied with intelligence and restraint, could achieve. But the vision was fragile. It depended on circumstances that could not be guaranteed, stable ownership, sufficient resources, a cultural consensus that valued the kind of refinement Sheffield had pursued. The house was built to endure physically, but the ideology it represented required constant maintenance. It needed inhabitants who understood what the house was for, who would continue to use it in ways that preserved its meaning. That continuity would not last. The house's location, its scale, its architectural quality, all the things that made it successful as a private monument, also made it vulnerable to appropriation. It was too well positioned, too substantial, too refined to remain indefinitely in private hands. The Crown would eventually notice it, and when the monarchy needed a London residence that could serve both private and ceremonial functions, Buckingham House would become an obvious candidate. Sheffield could not have predicted this outcome, but he would have understood its implications. The house he built to assert independence from royal authority would ultimately be consumed by it. The retreat he designed to escape the demands of public performance would become the stage for exactly that kind of performance. The vision would be preserved architecturally for a time, but its purpose would be inverted. What Sheffield built as a monument to withdrawal would become, against all intention, a monument to institutional power. The house required 40 staff to function properly. This was not excessive by aristocratic standards, but neither was it modest. 40 people working in coordinated silence, executing tasks that maintained the illusion that refined living required no effort at all. The staff were divided by rank and function: stewards, housekeepers, footmen, maids, kitchen workers, grooms, gardeners, each occupying a specific position within a hierarchy as rigid as the one that governed the family they served. They lived mostly in the service wings and attic spaces, areas designed to keep them invisible except when their presence was required. The architecture facilitated this invisibility. Servants' staircases ran parallel to the main stairs, allowing staff to move between floors without being seen. Service corridors connected the kitchen to the dining room, the laundry to the bedchambers, the storage areas to the staterooms. The house was engineered so that labor could flow through it continuously while remaining unobserved. The daily rhythm began before dawn. Kitchen staff rose first, lighting fires, preparing breakfast, beginning the slow work of food preparation that would continue throughout the day. Housemaids followed, cleaning fireplaces, sweeping floors, dusting surfaces. Footmen laid tables, polished silver, ensured that every public space was immaculate before the family woke. By the time the Duke or Duchess appeared, the house had already been in operation for hours. Meals structured the day. Breakfast was informal, taken privately or with family. Dinner, served in the early afternoon during Sheffield's era, was the principal meal, a production that required multiple courses, precise timing, and flawless service. Supper came later, lighter but still ceremonial. Between meals, the household maintained a schedule of activities that varied by season and circumstance but followed predictable patterns: correspondence in the morning, receiving visitors in the afternoon, reading or private pursuits in the evening. The art collection required constant care. Paintings needed proper light and stable temperature. Sculpture had to be dusted without damage. The objects Sheffield had assembled, coins, medals, manuscripts, decorative pieces, were not merely possessions but instruments of cultural authority, and they demanded treatment accordingly. A curator of sorts managed the collection, though the term did not yet exist in formal usage. Someone maintained inventories, tracked condition, arranged displays. The library functioned similarly. Books were valuable objects, expensive to acquire and easily damaged. They were shelved according to system, catalogued, handled with care. The room itself was designed to support serious reading, adequate light, comfortable seating, acoustics that allowed for quiet conversation or solitary concentration. Sheffield used the library regularly, not as ornament but as workspace. The house enabled this use through design and through the labor that kept the space perpetually ready. The gardens employed a separate staff entirely. Groundskeepers maintained the formal beds, pruned hedges, managed the balance between cultivated order and natural growth. The work was seasonal but relentless. Gardens could not be neglected without visible consequences. They required daily attention, weekly planning, annual cycles of planting and maintenance. The result was landscape that appeared effortless but existed only through continuous intervention. Social occasions disrupted routine but followed their own protocols. When the Duke entertained, the house transformed. Additional staff were hired temporarily. Food preparation intensified. State rooms were opened and arranged. Guests arrived at appointed times, were received with calculated formality, moved through spaces in sequences designed to maximize effect. The entertainment, conversation, music, viewing of art, unfolded according to social codes that everyone present understood implicitly. These gatherings were not frequent. Sheffield was selective about whom he invited and when. Each occasion served a purpose, cultivating relationships, demonstrating cultural authority, reciprocating invitations received elsewhere. The house was designed to host such events, but it was not built primarily for entertaining. It was built for inhabitation, and the social calendar existed within that larger framework rather than dominating it. The cost of maintaining this life was substantial and continuous. Salaries for 40 staff, even at the modest wages paid to domestic workers, accumulated significantly. Food for the household, family, guests, and servants, required constant expenditure. Fuel for heating, candles for lighting, materials for cleaning and maintenance, all represented ongoing expense. The house consumed resources simply by existing, and it consumed more resources the better it was maintained. Sheffield's income derived from multiple sources: rents from estates, returns on investments, revenue from offices he had held. The wealth was sufficient, but it required management. Stewards handled accounts, tracked expenditures, ensured that resources flowed appropriately. The household operated as an economic entity, a small-scale economy that needed balance between income and outlay. Aristocratic life of this kind was not sustainable through wealth alone. It required financial competence. The spatial organization of the house reinforced social hierarchy at every level. The family occupied the first floor almost exclusively, the rooms with the best proportions, the finest finishes, the most carefully considered details. Guests were received in these spaces but did not penetrate beyond them unless specifically invited to private apartments. Staff worked throughout the house but were confined to service areas when not actively performing duties in family spaces. Everyone knew where they belonged. This segregation was not merely social convention. It was architectural fact. The house was designed to maintain boundaries, to ensure that different classes of people could coexist within the same structure without inappropriate mixing. The separation was nearly total. Staff could work for years in the house without ever entering certain rooms. Family members could live comfortably without ever seeing the kitchens, laundries, or quarters where their servants lived. The routine sustained itself through discipline. Staff were trained to perform their roles without supervision, to anticipate needs before they were articulated, to correct problems before they became visible. The family, for their part, maintained schedules that allowed the household to function predictably. Everyone adhered to codes of behavior that made the system workable. Deviation was rare and quickly corrected. But the system was also fragile. It required continuous resources, stable ownership, and commitment to maintaining standards. Any disruption, financial difficulty, change in ownership, shift in priorities, could destabilize the entire operation. The household existed in a state of managed equilibrium, functional but dependent on conditions remaining constant. The house itself aged. Materials deteriorated. Fashions changed. What had seemed modern in 1705 began to feel dated by the 1730s. Repairs were necessary, updates desirable. Each intervention required money and decision-making. The building demanded care just as the collection did, just as the gardens did. Nothing could be left unattended without consequence. Sheffield's widow managed the household after his death with the same attention he had applied. Their son inherited both the property and the responsibility of maintaining it. The routines continued largely unchanged. Staff turned over gradually, replaced by new workers trained to the same standards. The collection grew modestly. The gardens matured. The house settled into its role as an established estate, no longer new but not yet old, functioning exactly as designed. This continuity depended on the family's willingness to invest in preservation. They could have chosen differently, sold the property, reduced staff, neglected maintenance. That they did not reflected commitment to the vision Sheffield had established. The house was not merely an asset. It was a statement that required upkeep, a performance that could not be sustained passively. By mid-century, Buckingham House had become what Sheffield intended, a model of aristocratic life conducted with discipline and taste. It functioned smoothly because every element, architecture, staff, routine, expenditure, had been calibrated to support a specific ideal. The life it enabled looked effortless from the outside, but that effortlessness was achieved through constant, invisible labor. The system worked until circumstances changed. When the Crown purchased the house in 1761, it acquired not just a building but an entire operational structure. The question was whether that structure could be adapted to serve different purposes, or whether the transition from private estate to royal residence would require fundamental reorganization. The routines that had sustained aristocratic cultivation would prove inadequate for institutional monarchy. The house that had functioned perfectly as a retreat would struggle to function as a palace. George III was 22 when he purchased Buckingham House. He had been king for less than a year, newly married to Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and already uncomfortable with the ceremonial obligations his position demanded. St. James's Palace served as the official royal residence, but George found it oppressive, too public, too formal, too bound to the rituals of court life that he instinctively disliked. He wanted something different. Not a palace. A home. The opportunity arose through inheritance and financial circumstance. The Duke of Buckingham's illegitimate son, Sir Charles Sheffield, had inherited the property but lacked the resources to maintain it properly. By 1761, he was willing to sell. George III, advised that the house would suit his needs, agreed to purchase it for £28,000. The transaction was presented as a private acquisition, the king buying property for his family's personal use, not an expansion of royal holdings. The distinction mattered legally and symbolically. The house appealed to George for exactly the reasons it had appealed to Sheffield decades earlier. It was removed from the immediate pressures of Westminster and the court. It was substantial but not overwhelming. It possessed refinement without ostentation. George understood that monarchy required public performance, but he believed it also required private refuge. Buckingham House would provide that refuge. St. James's would remain the official seat. Buckingham House would be where the royal family actually lived. Charlotte moved in first, while George continued to reside primarily at St. James's. The house became known as the Queen's House, a designation that emphasized its domestic rather than ceremonial function. The existing interiors were retained largely intact, though modifications began almost immediately. Royal households required different infrastructure than aristocratic ones, more security, more administrative space, accommodation for a larger permanent staff. The changes were gradual, implemented without dramatic reconstruction. The art collection remained, absorbed into the royal collection but kept largely in place. George had his own collecting interests, books primarily, scientific instruments, maps, and these began to fill the spaces Sheffield had designed for similar purposes. The library expanded. New acquisitions arrived regularly. The house became a repository not just for inherited aristocratic taste but for the king's personal intellectual pursuits. George used the house differently than Sheffield had. Where Sheffield had entertained selectively to cultivate cultural authority, George withdrew almost entirely from social obligation when at Buckingham House. He valued it as escape, not as stage. He spent time with his family there. Charlotte bore 15 children over the next 2 decades, and the house became the setting for domestic life conducted as privately as royal life permitted. Meals were taken together. Children were raised in the upper floors. The routines were familial rather than ceremonial. This shift in purpose created tension within the household structure. The staff who had served aristocratic cultivation now served royal domesticity, and the two functions did not align perfectly. Royal security requirements conflicted with the openness aristocratic entertaining had assumed. Administrative demands expanded beyond what the existing service infrastructure could accommodate easily. The House, designed for selective withdrawal, was being asked to support something more complex, a royal household attempting to function as both private family and public institution. George resisted pressure to formalize the arrangement. He did not want Buckingham House to become another palace. He wanted it to remain what it had been, a retreat. But the monarchy did not easily permit such distinctions. Even private royal residences attracted public attention, required state oversight, generated political scrutiny. The house could not remain purely domestic simply because the king wished it. Parliament questioned the expenditure involved in maintaining the property. George financed most improvements from his own income, but the boundary between private and public royal spending was always ambiguous. When he commissioned work to expand the library or improve the grounds, critics asked whether this was personal indulgence or state necessity. The questions were impossible to answer cleanly because the king himself was never purely private. The children complicated everything. Royal offspring required education, supervision, security, and eventual establishment in their own households. As the family grew, Buckingham House became increasingly crowded. Nurseries occupied the upper floors. Tutors and governesses required accommodation. The domestic simplicity George had sought became harder to maintain as the practical demands of raising a large royal family asserted themselves. Charlotte managed the household with attention to economy and order. She understood that the house represented a specific kind of value, not ceremonial grandeur but domestic stability, and she worked to preserve that character. She oversaw staff, managed expenditures, ensured that the children were raised with discipline. The house under her supervision remained functional and relatively restrained, avoiding the excesses that characterized some royal establishments. But the tension between private use and public ownership never resolved. The house technically belonged to the king personally, purchased with funds that were his to spend. Yet it was maintained partly through state resources, staffed by personnel whose salaries came from civil list allocations, and used for purposes that occasionally included state business. George conducted meetings there, received ministers, handled correspondence. The house was not purely a retreat, no matter how much he wished it to be. The grounds provided some insulation. The gardens remained extensive, offering space for walking, riding, private recreation. George expanded them gradually, adding features that reflected his interests, botanical specimens, carefully planned paths, areas designed for solitude. The landscape became his refuge within the refuge, a place where he could escape even the reduced demands of domestic life. By the 1780s, the house had settled into an established pattern. It was not a palace. It was not fully private. It existed in an ambiguous category, a royal residence used primarily for domestic purposes but unable to escape the political and symbolic weight that attached to anything the monarchy occupied. George continued to prefer it to St. James's, continued to resist efforts to formalize or expand its public functions. But his resistance was only partially successful. The king's mental health deteriorated periodically beginning in the 1780s, creating crises that disrupted the household and raised questions about succession and regency. During these episodes, Buckingham House became a site of political tension, doctors, advisors, and family members navigating the collapse of the domestic order George had tried to maintain. The house could not protect him from the pressures of monarchy, and those pressures invaded even the spaces he had claimed as private. Charlotte remained at Buckingham House after George's condition worsened permanently. She continued to live there through the Regency period, maintaining routines even as the political situation shifted around her. The house aged with her. Fashions changed. What had seemed refined in 1761 began to feel outdated by the early 19th century. Maintenance continued, but updates were minimal. The house was no longer new, no longer a statement of contemporary taste. It was simply where the Queen lived. When Charlotte died in 1818, the question of Buckingham House's future became urgent. George IV, as Prince Regent and then as King, had his own residences and his own architectural ambitions. He did not need the house for domestic purposes. But its location, its scale, and its established infrastructure made it valuable for another reason entirely. The monarchy needed a proper London palace, not a retreat, but a working ceremonial centre. Buckingham House occupied the right site, possessed adequate land, and could potentially be transformed. The decision to convert it was not immediate. George IV hesitated, aware that reconstruction would be expensive and controversial. But the pressure was undeniable. St. James's was inadequate. The monarchy required visibility, infrastructure for state occasions, a building that projected appropriate grandeur. Buckingham House, as it existed, could not serve these functions. But the property it occupied could. The purchase in 1761 had been presented as private acquisition for domestic use. 6 decades later, that purpose had exhausted itself. The house had served the royal family adequately as a home, but institutional needs now superseded private ones. George III had bought the property to escape the demands of monarchy. His son would remake it to meet those demands fully. The transformation from private residence to public palace was not what George III had intended, but by 1820, intention no longer mattered. The house would be sacrificed to the institution it had briefly sheltered. By 1820, the British monarchy faced a legitimacy problem it could not ignore. The problem was not constitutional. Parliament had settled questions of succession and royal authority decades earlier. The problem was perceptual. The monarchy had become simultaneously too visible and not visible enough. George IV's personal scandals, his estranged wife's public humiliations, the regency's excesses, all of these had made the institution appear ridiculous. But the monarchy lacked the architectural infrastructure to project an alternative image. It needed to be seen differently, and that required a stage adequate to the performance. European monarchies had solved this problem through architecture. The Habsburgs had Schönbrunn. The Bourbons had Versailles, now repurposed but still symbolically potent. The Russian court had the Winter Palace. These were not merely residences. They were instruments of statecraft, buildings designed to communicate power, stability, and permanence. Britain had nothing comparable. Windsor was a medieval fortress, impressive but remote. St. James's was cramped, outdated, architecturally incoherent. Hampton Court was a relic. The British Crown operated from buildings that suggested either antiquity or inadequacy, neither of which served the monarchy's current needs. The political context intensified these pressures. Post-Napoleonic Europe was reorganizing around new principles of sovereignty and national identity. Monarchies that survived did so partly by adapting their public presentation, by learning to perform legitimacy in ways that addressed both traditional elites and emerging middle-class audiences. This required visibility, ceremony conducted at scale, state occasions staged with precision. The British monarchy understood these requirements intellectually but lacked the physical infrastructure to meet them. Parliament provided the immediate pressure. Members questioned why the Crown occupied inadequate facilities when public funds supported royal expenditure. The argument was not sympathetic. Many MPs had little affection for George IV personally, but it was pragmatic. A functioning monarchy required functional buildings. If the existing palaces were insufficient, something needed to change. The question was not whether to invest in royal architecture but how much to spend and on what. George IV had architectural ambitions that exceeded even what Parliament might have tolerated. He had already commissioned extensive work at Windsor, transforming the medieval castle into something grander and more cohesive. He had rebuilt the Royal Pavilion at Brighton into an extravagant fantasy of Orientalist design. He understood architecture as expression, and he wanted buildings that expressed monarchical authority without restraint. Buckingham House represented an opportunity to achieve that ambition in London. But the house, as it stood, was entirely wrong for the purpose. It was too small for large state functions. Its interiors were designed for domestic life, not ceremonial display. The rooms that had worked perfectly for George III family gatherings could not accommodate the receptions, levees, and formal occasions that modern monarchy required. The building would need to be expanded dramatically, reorganized internally, and represented externally to serve as a working palace. The resistance to this transformation came not from sentiment but from cost. Preliminary estimates suggested the work would be expensive, more expensive than similar projects at other royal properties. Nash, the architect George IV favored, had a reputation for ambitious design and escalating budgets. Members of Parliament who authorized funding knew they were entering a process that would likely exceed initial projections. They approved it anyway, partly because no alternative presented itself. The timing was significant. Britain in the 1820s was navigating post-war economic adjustment, political reform pressures, and social tensions that made royal extravagance particularly visible. Newspapers reported on every aspect of court life with scrutiny that previous generations had not experienced. Public opinion mattered in ways it had not mattered before. The monarchy could not simply build without regard for how that building would be perceived. George IV framed the reconstruction as national necessity rather than personal preference. The argument was calculated. Britain's capital required a palace that reflected the nation's status as a global power. London needed a building that could host foreign dignitaries, stage ceremonial occasions, and project an image of stability and grandeur. Buckingham House, transformed into Buckingham Palace, would serve these functions. The expenditure was not indulgence. It was investment in the monarchy's ability to perform its constitutional role. The argument convinced enough people to secure initial funding, but it did not silence criticism. The project became contentious almost immediately. Nash's designs were deemed too expensive, then revised, then expanded again. The scope of work grew as the inadequacies of the existing structure became apparent. What began as renovation became wholesale reconstruction. Costs climbed accordingly. Parliament responded with inquiries, committees, and public accounting that made the entire process politically fraught. Every expenditure was scrutinized. Every design decision was questioned. The monarchy found itself in the uncomfortable position of having to justify architectural choices to elected representatives who had no interest in royal aesthetics and considerable interest in fiscal restraint. The palace was being built under conditions that made grand vision nearly impossible. George IV did not handle this scrutiny gracefully. He pushed for expensive materials, elaborate details, and design elements that served symbolic rather than functional purposes. He wanted a palace that would rival continental equivalents, and he was willing to spend whatever was necessary to achieve it. Nash, caught between the king's demands and Parliament's restrictions, attempted compromises that satisfied neither party. The project became paralyzed by competing pressures. The public discourse around the reconstruction revealed deeper anxieties about monarchy itself. Critics questioned whether Britain needed a palace at all. They pointed to the cost, the excess, the apparent disconnect between royal spending and national priorities. They argued that the monarchy should operate with republican simplicity, that grandeur was incompatible with constitutional government. These were not fringe positions. They appeared in major newspapers, were voiced in Parliament, and reflected genuine uncertainty about what role monarchy should play in modern political life. Supporters countered that ceremony mattered, that nations required symbols, that the monarchy's public functions justified appropriate facilities. They argued that Britain's international standing depended partly on its ability to host foreign powers with appropriate grandeur, that diplomatic relations were conducted through ritual and display as much as through negotiation. A palace was not luxury. It was infrastructure. Both arguments had merit, and neither resolved the underlying tension. The monarchy existed in an ambiguous constitutional position, still powerful enough to require deference, no longer powerful enough to act without accountability. Buckingham Palace became the physical manifestation of that ambiguity. It was being built to project authority the monarchy no longer possessed absolutely, funded through a process that demonstrated the limits of that authority. The work continued through the 1820s, slow and contested. George IV visited the site periodically, demanded changes, expressed dissatisfaction with progress. Nash managed contractors, navigated budget constraints, and attempted to preserve some coherence in the design despite constant revisions. The palace was being built without clear vision, shaped by compromise rather than conviction. George IV died in 1830 without ever occupying the finished building. His brother, William IV, inherited both the crown and the half-completed palace. William had no interest in the project. He found the whole endeavor wasteful and would have preferred to abandon it entirely. But the expenditure had been too great, the political investment too substantial. The palace would be finished, whether the current king wanted it or not. The institutional momentum had become irreversible. What had started as George IV architectural ambition had become a state project that transcended individual preference. The monarchy needed a London palace. Buckingham House had been selected, purchased, and partially demolished. The only path forward was completion. The building would be finished not because anyone particularly wanted it anymore, but because the alternative, leaving it incomplete, was politically and symbolically impossible. By the time Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the palace existed as a functional building, though still incomplete in many respects. She would be the first monarch to actually use it as intended, to occupy it as a working residence and ceremonial center. But the palace she inherited bore all the marks of its contested creation. It was functional without being loved, necessary without being desired, adequate for its purpose but compromised by the process that produced it. The pressure to perform had generated a building, but it had not generated architecture that anyone could claim as triumph. The work began with measurement and assessment. Nash's surveyors documented the existing structure in detail, dimensions, materials, load-bearing walls, foundations. What they found was a building constructed solidly but not designed for the stresses that palace functions would impose. The walls could not support additional floors. The foundations were inadequate for significant lateral expansion. The internal organization, rooms sized for family life rather than state ceremony, could not be adapted without fundamental reorganization. The conclusion was unavoidable: the house could not be renovated. It would have to be rebuilt from within. Nash proposed encasing the original structure in a new shell. The central block would remain, stripped to its structural core, then surrounded by extensions that would triple the building's footprint. New wings would create a quadrangle, enclosing a central courtyard. The façade would be entirely replaced, the warm red brick covered with Bath stone, the proportions altered to project institutional scale rather than domestic refinement. What emerged would bear almost no visual relationship to what had existed. The demolition proceeded in stages. Workers removed the interiors first: paneling, plasterwork, decorative elements that had defined the house's character. Rooms that Sheffield had commissioned, that George III family had inhabited, were stripped to bare walls. The art collection had already been relocated. The furniture was removed. What remained was architectural skeleton, and even that would not survive intact. The process was neither careful nor reverent. This was not restoration. It was extraction of whatever could be reused and destruction of everything else. Materials were salvaged where practical: stone, timber, hardware, but most of the original fabric was simply demolished and carted away. The house disappeared piece by piece, replaced by something that shared only its location and name. Nash's design was ambitious but compromised from the start. He envisioned a palace that would rival European equivalents in scale and grandeur, but he was working within constraints that made such ambitions nearly impossible. The budget was limited and constantly scrutinized. The site was bounded by existing streets and properties, limiting expansion. The foundation work revealed complications: unstable ground, water infiltration, structural issues that required expensive remediation before construction could proceed. The new façade was designed to communicate imperial authority. Bath stone replaced brick, chosen for its associations with classical architecture and monumental public buildings. The proportions were enlarged, the central entrance made more prominent, columns added to suggest grandeur. But the execution fell short of the conception. The stone was expensive, the craftsmanship uneven. The design, revised repeatedly to accommodate budget cuts, lost coherence. What was built looked neither fully classical nor fully modern, neither confidently traditional nor innovatively contemporary. Inside, the reorganization was even more radical. The original room sequence, designed for gradual revelation and intimate scale, was abandoned entirely. New staterooms were created by combining smaller spaces, raising ceilings, and installing decorative programs that bore no relationship to what had existed before. The throne room, the ballroom, the grand staircase, all were new constructions, imposed onto a footprint that had never been intended to accommodate them. The costs escalated exactly as critics had predicted. Initial estimates proved fantasy. Revisions required additional funding. Unexpected complications demanded expensive solutions. By 1828, the project was consuming resources far beyond what Parliament had authorized, and the political fallout was severe. Inquiries were launched. Nash was questioned, criticized, and eventually forced to defend every decision. The work slowed but did not stop. George IV demanded changes constantly. He wanted richer materials, more elaborate decoration, adjustments to designs that had already been executed and would now require demolition and reconstruction. Nash complied when possible, resisted when necessary, and watched his design become increasingly incoherent as competing demands distorted the original vision. The palace was being built by committee, shaped by compromise, and drained of whatever architectural conviction it might have possessed. The workforce was substantial, hundreds of laborers, craftsmen, and specialists working simultaneously on different aspects of the project. Stonemasons cut and placed the new façade. Carpenters built internal structures. Plasterers created decorative ceilings. Glaziers installed windows. Painters applied finishes. The coordination required was immense, and failures were frequent. Work completed in one area was sometimes undermined by work proceeding in another. Materials arrived late or in insufficient quantity. Weather delayed outdoor work. The site was chaos. What made the process particularly destructive was its incompleteness. Areas of the original house were demolished before their replacements were fully designed. Structural elements were removed, then found to be necessary, requiring expensive improvisation. The sequence of work was determined more by budget availability and political pressure than by logical construction progression. The building was being created and destroyed simultaneously, without clear direction or consistent vision. Nash's relationship with George IV deteriorated as the project dragged on. The king blamed the architect for cost overruns and delays. Nash blamed the king for constant changes and unrealistic expectations. Both were correct. The project had been misconceived from the beginning, attempting to create palace-scale grandeur on a site that could not support it, with funding that was insufficient, under political scrutiny that made coherent decision-making nearly impossible. The palace was being built in conditions that guaranteed failure. By 1830, when George IV died, the building was structurally complete but internally unfinished. The exterior appeared monumental but was already showing problems, stone weathering unevenly, details executed poorly, proportions that did not satisfy critics who had expected something more distinguished. The interior was a construction site, rooms roughed in but not completed, decoration partial, infrastructure installed but not fully functional. The palace existed but could not be occupied. William IV inherited the project with visible reluctance. He saw only expense and dysfunction, a building that had consumed vast resources without producing anything he valued. He proposed alternatives, converting the palace into barracks, using it for government offices, anything that would justify the expenditure by putting the building to practical use. Parliament considered these proposals but rejected them. The palace would remain a royal residence, not because it was wanted but because abandoning that purpose would acknowledge the entire project as waste. Work continued through the early 1830s, now stripped of even the pretense of architectural ambition. The goal was simply to make the building habitable and functional. Rooms were finished to adequate rather than exceptional standards. Decoration was simplified. Costs were contained by reducing quality. What had been envisioned as a showcase became merely serviceable. The original Buckingham House had by this point disappeared entirely. Every trace had been demolished, covered, or absorbed into the new construction. The proportions were different. The materials were different. The spatial experience was different. Nothing of Sheffield's vision survived except the site itself, and even that had been transformed, excavated for new foundations, expanded to accommodate the larger footprint, landscape to serve ceremonial rather than contemplative purposes. Nash himself was dismissed before completion, his reputation damaged by the project's failures. He had entered the commission as the king's favored architect, respected for previous work. He left under accusation of mismanagement and extravagance. The palace had destroyed his standing as thoroughly as it had destroyed the building he had been hired to transform. The final costs were never fully accounted for, but estimates suggested the project had consumed several times its authorized budget. Parliament conducted inquiries that apportioned blame but could not recover the expenditure. The monarchy had its London palace, but the price had been political damage, public criticism, and architectural compromise that left the building respected by almost no one. What was lost in the reconstruction was not merely a building. It was a model of how architecture could express private cultivation, how wealth could be deployed toward refinement rather than display, how power could withdraw rather than perform. Buckingham House had represented an aristocratic ideal that was already becoming obsolete when George III purchased it. The palace that replaced it represented institutional necessity stripped of cultural ambition. The transformation was complete, violent, and irreversible. Nothing could be rebuilt. Nothing could be recovered. The extraction had been total. Victoria moved into Buckingham Palace in July 1837, 3 weeks after her accession. She was 18, unprepared for monarchy, and inheriting a building that was still incomplete. Workmen occupied entire wings. Rooms lacked furniture. The heating system failed regularly. The drains were inadequate, producing smells that permeated the lower floors. The palace was functional in theory but chaotic in practice. She would spend the next decade overseeing repairs, modifications, and the slow process of making the building actually habitable. The palace succeeded at what it had been designed to do. It provided space for state functions. The throne room could accommodate levees and formal receptions. The ballroom hosted events on a scale that St. James's could never have managed. Foreign dignitaries were received in settings that communicated appropriate grandeur. The building worked as infrastructure, as stage for ceremonial monarchy. It fulfilled its institutional purpose adequately if not elegantly. But it failed as a home. The rooms were too large, too formal, too impersonal. The corridors were long and cold. The acoustics made private conversation difficult in spaces designed for crowds. The palace had been built for performance, and performance was incompatible with domesticity. Victoria felt this immediately. She described the building in letters as uncomfortable, inconvenient, unsuited to family life. She occupied it because duty required it, not because she wanted to. The staff required to operate the palace was enormous, several hundred people working in shifts to maintain the building, prepare meals, manage security, coordinate events. The household structure was complex and hierarchical, divided between ceremonial positions inherited from earlier eras and practical positions required by the building's scale. The two systems overlapped awkwardly. Responsibility was diffuse. Simple tasks required coordination across multiple departments. The palace was inefficient by design. The building's problems became more apparent with use. The roof leaked. The foundation settled unevenly, causing cracks. The ventilation was inadequate, making some rooms stuffy and others drafty. These were not minor inconveniences. They were structural deficiencies that resulted from hasty construction and compromised design. The palace required constant maintenance, constant repair, constant attention simply to remain functional. Victoria's marriage to Albert in 1840 intensified the space problems. The royal couple needed private apartments that the palace, designed primarily for ceremony, could not easily provide. They needed nurseries for children, workrooms for Albert's projects, spaces that could function as family areas rather than staterooms. Edward Bloor was commissioned to add an entire new wing facing the mall, enclosing the courtyard completely and creating additional residential space. The palace was being modified almost as soon as it was occupied. The public façade, the face the palace presented to the street, was replaced entirely in 1913, long after Victoria's death. The original Nash design was deemed architecturally unsatisfactory and was refronted in Portland stone. The palace that tourists photograph today bears no resemblance to what Nash built, which bore no resemblance to what Sheffield built. The building has been remade repeatedly, each intervention erasing more of what came before. What the palace became, ultimately, was a stage. It exists to host state occasions, to provide backdrop for national ceremony, to serve as a recognizable symbol in photographs and broadcasts. It is functional for these purposes. But it possesses no architectural distinction. It is not admired for its design. It is not studied as an example of successful palace architecture. It is simply there, large, prominent, necessary, but architecturally unremarkable. The palace's role solidified through repetition. Each state visit, each ceremonial occasion, each public appearance reinforced its function as institutional backdrop. The building became inseparable from the events it hosted. Its meaning derived not from architecture but from association. It mattered because things happened there, not because of what it was. Victoria used the palace when required but preferred other residences. Windsor became her primary home. Balmoral and Osborne offered retreat from official obligations. Buckingham Palace remained necessary, politically, ceremonially, symbolically, but it was not loved. It was occupied out of duty, maintained because abandoning it was impossible, endured because monarchy required it. The contrast with the original Buckingham House was absolute. Sheffield had built a retreat that projected cultural authority through restraint. The palace projected institutional authority through scale. Sheffield's house had been designed for selective withdrawal. The palace was designed for maximum visibility. The house had valued privacy. The palace demanded performance. Every principle had been inverted. The palace also failed economically in ways the house never had. Sheffield had financed Buckingham House from private wealth, and its maintenance, while expensive, was proportional to aristocratic resources. The palace required state funding to operate, and that funding was perpetually contested. Parliament questioned every expenditure. The monarchy defended every allocation. The building became a recurring source of political friction, its costs visible and its value debatable. The cultural emptiness was equally stark. Buckingham House had contained one of England's notable private art collections, assembled with discernment and displayed with care. The palace contained art as well, much of it from the royal collection, some of exceptional quality, but it was displayed institutionally rather than personally. The rooms were designed to accommodate crowds, not to reward sustained attention. The art became decoration rather than collection, present but not central to the building's purpose. The palace succeeded dynastically. It provided space for the continuity of monarchy, births, marriages, state business conducted across generations. Victoria died there. Edward VII occupied it. George V used it throughout his reign. The building served its function adequately, generation after generation. But service was all it provided. It enabled monarchy without enriching it. The staff who worked there experienced the palace as workplace rather than household. The scale made personal relationships difficult. The hierarchy was rigid and impersonal. The work was specialized and repetitive. This was employment, not service in the older aristocratic sense where staff might spend entire lives in a single household and develop some investment in its character. Palace staff came and went. The institution persisted, but the human continuity that had characterized earlier aristocratic establishments was absent. The building aged without acquiring the patina of history. Old buildings often become more valued over time, their age conferring distinction. Buckingham Palace simply became worn. Each renovation addressed deterioration without adding character. The palace was maintained but not cherished, preserved functionally but not culturally. It remained necessary without becoming beloved. By the 20th century, the palace's function had narrowed further. It was no longer a residence in any meaningful sense, the royal family occupied only small portions of it, and even that occupation was often ceremonial. It became primarily a venue, for garden parties, state banquets, investitures, official audiences. The building existed to facilitate events, its rooms rearranged constantly to accommodate different functions. It was hotel, conference center, and museum simultaneously, but it was not a home. The hollow inheritance was this, a building that functioned adequately for institutional purposes while possessing no architectural merit, cultural depth, or human warmth. It succeeded narrowly and failed broadly. It provided what monarchy required, space, visibility, infrastructure, while eliminating everything that had made the original house valuable. The extraction had been so complete that even the building's success felt like loss. Buckingham Palace would continue to serve the monarchy indefinitely. It was too embedded in national symbolism, too functionally necessary, too expensive to abandon. But it would serve without distinction, operate without grace, persist without being admired. It was the building that monarchy needed, built by destroying the building that aristocratic culture had created. The transformation worked. But what it produced was less than what it consumed. The palace stands. The house is gone. The difference between them is the measure of what was lost. Few visual records of the original Buckingham House survive. A handful of engravings show the exterior from different angles, careful renderings that captured proportion and detail but cannot convey spatial experience or material presence. A small number of drawings document specific interiors, the gallery, the great staircase, individual staterooms. These images are fragmentary, incomplete, created for purposes unrelated to historical preservation. No one in the 18th century imagined the building would disappear entirely, so no one thought to document it comprehensively. What remains instead are inventories. Lists compiled when the property changed hands, when collections were valued for insurance or inheritance, when the crown took possession. These documents record objects, paintings, furniture, decorative pieces, with varying degrees of specificity. Some entries are detailed enough to identify individual works. Others are vague to the point of uselessness, one large mirror, 2 gilt chairs, various porcelain. The inventories confirm that the house contained exceptional objects, but they cannot reconstruct how those objects were arranged or experienced. Written descriptions exist but are equally limited. Visitors occasionally mention Buckingham House in letters or published accounts, usually in passing. They noted impressions, the elegance of the interiors, the quality of the collection, the refinement of the gardens, without providing the kind of systematic description that would allow reconstruction. The house was admired but taken for granted. It seemed permanent, established, unlikely to vanish. No one wrote as though they were creating a record for a future in which the building would no longer exist. The architectural plans present their own problems. Drawings survive showing the house's layout, but they are technical documents, not descriptive ones. They indicate room dimensions and structural relationships but say nothing about finishes, color, light, or atmosphere. They show where walls stood but not what it felt like to move through the spaces those walls defined. The plans are blueprints for reconstruction but not guides to experience. This documentary poverty is not unique to Buckingham House. Most buildings of the era are similarly underdocumented. Comprehensive architectural photography did not exist. Preservation movements had not yet developed the impulse to record threatened structures systematically. Buildings were assumed to endure, or if they did not, their loss was accepted as inevitable. The idea that a significant aristocratic mansion might be completely erased and that this erasure would matter culturally was not yet established. What survives, then, is outline without substance. We know the house's dimensions, its basic organization, some of its contents. We can identify its architect and trace its ownership. But we cannot stand in its rooms. We cannot see how light moved through its windows or how the art collection appeared when displayed as Sheffield intended. We cannot experience the spatial sequence that visitors would have encountered or understand fully how the architecture shaped social interaction. The gaps in the archive create interpretive problems. Historians can describe what Buckingham House was in general terms but cannot reconstruct it with precision. The building exists now primarily as idea, as symbol of a particular model of aristocratic life, as counterpoint to what replaced it. The actual physical reality, the material presence that people inhabited and experienced, has been reduced to fragments and inference. This is what extraction means at the level of cultural memory. The palace did not merely replace the house physically. It replaced it in memory, becoming so dominant that earlier iterations became difficult to access. Most people who visit Buckingham Palace today do not know that an entirely different building once occupied the site. They see the palace as original, as though it had always existed in its current form. The house has been erased not just architecturally but historically. The erasure extends beyond the building itself to the model of life it represented. The idea that power could be exercised through withdrawal, that cultural authority could be demonstrated through selective privacy, that refinement mattered more than visibility, these principles feel alien now, incompatible with contemporary understandings of how institutions should function. The palace represents transparency, accessibility, performance. The house represented the opposite. Modern sensibilities align with the palace, making the house's values harder to comprehend or appreciate. This creates a kind of double loss. The building is gone, and the cultural framework that made the building meaningful is also gone. We can describe what Sheffield built, but we cannot fully recover why it mattered in the way it did. The significance exists in documents and descriptions, but the lived reality that gave that significance weight has disappeared. We are left reading records of something we can no longer entirely understand. The palace itself contains almost no trace of what preceded it. Somewhere beneath the current structure, fragments of the original foundation likely remain, sections of wall, portions of the infrastructure, archaeological residue. But these fragments are inaccessible, buried under layers of later construction. They exist but cannot be seen, studied, or interpreted. The palace has sealed the house beneath it, making excavation impossible without destroying what currently stands. A few objects from Sheffield's collection survive in various locations, some in the royal collection, others dispersed to museums and private hands through sales and inheritance. These objects can be identified through provenance research, traced back to inventories that placed them at Buckingham House during specific periods. But they have been removed from context. A painting that once hung in a specific room, viewed in specific light, as part of a larger program of display, now hangs in a gallery or storage facility, divorced from everything that gave it meaning within the house. The gardens are similarly lost. The palace grounds bear no relationship to what Sheffield designed. The formal beds, the sightlines, the spatial organization, all were destroyed when the site was expanded and re-landscaped to serve different purposes. Modern visitors walk through gardens that were created in the 19th and 20th centuries, shaped by Victorian and later aesthetic principles. The earlier landscape exists only in descriptions too vague to allow reconstruction. What cannot be rebuilt is not just the physical structure but the entire ecology of meaning that surrounded it. The house existed within a specific social world, functioned according to specific cultural codes, embodied specific ideas about power, taste, and identity. That world is as inaccessible now as the building itself. We can study it historically, but we cannot recreate the lived experience of inhabiting or visiting the house, of understanding implicitly what it signified to people who operated within its cultural framework. This is the final form of extraction, the conversion of lived experience into archive, of presence into absence. The palace stands, functional and visible. The house is gone, surviving only as fragments in scattered collections and incomplete descriptions in old documents. The relationship between the two is not continuity but rupture. The palace did not evolve from the house. It replaced it. The question that remains is not whether the transformation was necessary. By the 1820s, institutional pressures made some form of change inevitable, but whether what was gained justified what was lost. The palace provided infrastructure for modern constitutional monarchy. It enabled ceremonies, hosted dignitaries, served state purposes for nearly 2 centuries. These were real achievements, genuine functions that mattered politically and symbolically. But the house represented something the palace could never provide, a vision of how power might be exercised through culture rather than display, how authority could be demonstrated through restraint rather than scale, how architecture could embody ideas rather than merely accommodate functions. That vision was incompatible with institutional monarchy, and so it was eliminated. The palace succeeded by erasing what came before. The story of Buckingham House matters not because the building was uniquely exceptional, other aristocratic mansions of the era possessed equal architectural merit, but because its transformation was so complete and its loss so symbolic. It represents a broader historical process, the subsumption of private cultural authority by public institutional power, the replacement of selective cultivation with obligatory visibility, the conversion of retreat into stage. Nothing can restore what was lost. The palace cannot be unmade. The house cannot be rebuilt. The archive is incomplete and will remain so. What we have are fragments, traces, descriptions that hint at something that once existed but can no longer be fully grasped. The palace stands as monument to institutional necessity. The house exists now only as memory of something else, something quieter, more private, more fragile, and ultimately unable to survive the pressures that modern monarchy imposed. The extraction was total. The inheritance is hollow. What remains is a building that works and a building that is forgotten. Both are true simultaneously, and neither can be changed.